Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I was going to fake you off, but okay. Thank you for braving the cold today. Welcome to Lunch with Books. At this time, we do ask that you silence your cell phones. We have a few program announcements before we get started. The first is that we will be closed next Monday, January 17th, for Martin Luther King Day. That's Monday, January 17th. Following Tuesday, 1 week from today, Tuesday, January 18th, at Lunch with Books, we'll have The Lost History of Frederick Douglass in Wheeling. Internationally known orator, abolitionist, editor, suffragist, and American reformist, the history and placement of Frederick Douglass in the field of Appalachian studies has not been considered and recognized until recently. John Muller, author and co-founder of Lost History Associates in Washington, D.C., will tell us about the sojourns of Frederick Douglass in Wheeling, which was part of a larger portfolio of more than half of a dozen visits that Frederick Douglass made to West Virginia, across West Virginia in the mid to late 1800s. That's next week, Tuesday at noon, January 18th. Then in 2 weeks, Tuesday, January 25th, if you look at, forgot to grab a calendar, but there are calendars on all the tables here. We do have two program changes. The one is that the January 25th program is now going to be a These Walls Can Talk, revisiting the McClure Hotel. This will be historical reenactments of visitors that came to the McClure Hotel. So in keeping with the new ownership and the rebirth of the McClure Hotel by Roxby Group, this talk will highlight the history along with biographies of some of the famous people who had some connection to it, including John McClure Sr., Ellsworth Statler, also known as E.M. Statler, General William Rosecrans, actresses Sandra Bernhardt and Henrietta Crossman, Wild West showman Buffalo Bill Cody, the notorious Senator Joseph McCarthy from my home state of Wisconsin, not our proudest moment, and Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and John F. Kennedy Jr. That's 2 weeks from today, January 25th at Lunch with Books. The other change on the calendar is the Thursday, January 20th program. We're going to have a special Lunch with Books. It was a Wheeling Symphony Orchestra preview for their first concert in 18 months, I think. They've unfortunately had to cancel all of their January programs, including that Lunch with Books. So that is, we will no longer be having that preview, WSO preview on Thursday, January 20th. But that the People's University on the 20th will still be doing that one. Okay, and on that vein, this coming Thursday, January 13th at 7 p.m., the next People's University class for the Cold War series will have Dr. Korkek Hale, Associate Professor of History at the Zanesville campus of Ohio University. That's class 7. It covers Reagan and Gorbachev era. She'll talk about their rise to power, the reforms, the Warsaw Pact, the reunification of Germany, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's this coming Thursday, January 13th at 7 p.m. She'll also be with us on the following Thursday, January 30th. And that'll be the last People's University in that series. Duck and Cover is the Cold War Over. All right. Today's guest is Wheeling resident and history researcher Ed Phillips. He's a board member of the Friends of Wheeling Preservation Group, the Ohio County Public Library Board of Trustees, and was a long-term member of the West Virginia Independence Hall Foundation. And he's also a 2001 West Virginia History Hero. Civil War enthusiast, he compiled the books Lincoln's Bastille, the Athenaeum, the story of the building 1855 to 1868, and Colonel J. Thoburn and the 1st West Virginia Infantry Regiment, a history. And he also co-edited and compiled Carlin's Wheeling Battery, a history of Battery D, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery with Linda Fluharty. Please welcome Ed Phillips.
Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about a building which stood on the corner of John and Market Street. We now know John, of course, is 16th Street, right across the street. In fact, it stood where the Pythian pillars stand now. And unfortunately, we only have one picture of the building. It's right there in the corner. It is the only known photo. There is no photograph that we have been able to locate anyplace. The building was built in 1853 to 1854, the same time as the Custom House, or Independence Hall as we call it now, right across the street. They both were built using the same type of materials and were the most modern construction west of the Alleghenies at the time. They were built with cast iron beams in the roofs and the floors, which was only done in places like Philadelphia and Baltimore. The building itself was 3 stories. The first 2 floors were devoted to a business by a man, I can't think of the name of the company, but their main business was dealing strictly with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Unfortunately, according to what we've been able to find out about them, the business was there for about 4 years, but was really not successful, and we don't know why. The 3rd floor is the part which I'm going to mainly talk about to start with. That was built as a theater, hence the name, the Athenaeum. It was a very large building. Let me see here if I can get the right. And this is the only drawing or anything we even have of the building. The building is, as you can see it, ignore the other part until later. We'll get to that in 1863. Okay, the building is described as being, they say 4 stories, but they are counting a basement, which did not exist yet. The first story is stone. The top 2 stories are red brick. There is a wide staircase at the northeast end of the building, which led up to the 3rd floor. So customers did not have to go through the whole building to get up to the theater. It had 1 entrance on Market Street and 2 on John Street. Now the theater was described as probably the most modern and up-to-date theater west of the Alleghenies, between the Allegheny Mountains and Chicago. It had an extremely large stage with rooms in the back for dressing rooms for the actors. It had a large ground floor and included a balcony. And the whole building cost about $50,000 upon its building, which they said was a lot of money. In fact, over $10,000, 10,000 of that was for scenery, for the acting. But one thing that really excited the reviewers of the building when they first saw it was it had an excellent heating system. So the building could be used year-round, which I guess was a problem then, as it is nowadays too. Let me see here. The first play took place in 1854. I don't have the exact date right off, but there is the program. The very first performance. And you'll notice Macbeth and the subtitle, King of the Colored Man. Sometimes that appears as King of the Negroes, which is a term we can't use nowadays, but there it is. And you'll notice there are very few actors in these plays. So all these plays had to be in a shortened version. And they normally would run 2 plays, one a serious type play, followed by a comedy. And sometimes in between them, they would have a vaudeville act of someone singing or dancing or something to get it. The most popular play, however, was one which is called Ingomar the Barbarian. So I had Nate upstairs at the library reference desk. We researched it and actually found a copy of the play. It was written in 1851 by a German, a baron, wrote it. It was called Sons of the Wilderness. Well, it got translated into English by Mary Lovell around 1852 or 3, which is a performance that is done here in Wheeling. There it is. Should be Ingemar the Barbarian. The play was so popular, it was first done in the United States in 1860, around 1860, in Boston and in New York, although it did appear here in 1855 with two characters. Two speaking characters. There were other characters in the play. The play takes place in ancient Greece, which is the reason for the odd names of Parthenia for the main actress. Ingemar was a German, a barbarian. Now, when the play was shown, why I read the play and why they got excited about it, I don't know. It's a 5-act play, and which of course ends up being the bad barbarian falls in love with the young, rich Greek lady, and carries on. In fact, her father is captured by the evil Germans and all kind of problems. However, the play appears to have changed as it moved across this country. We came across a review of the play written in the year 1861. The play was given in a town called Silver City, which is southwest someplace, we think, in Colorado. Ingemar is still the main character. Now Ingemar is a Comanche Indian warrior. In fact, the man who wrote the review, and he wrote a 2-page review. He went through every scene and every act in the play, reviewed it. And his only main comment was the costuming was kind of odd for the West to see an Indian dressed in a long tunic type robe. And he said, there were no Greek accents in sight. The man who wrote the review is well known by you, if I can find his name. Mark Twain wrote the review. We found a later review written in 1895. The play was still being played 40 years later and was still extremely popular. In fact, the two main actresses in the United States at the time it was their main repertoire, and they would do it. The play was shown here in Wheeling at least once every season. Now, the theater would bring in a man, and a man named Hancher was the most popular one, and he was here for about 3 years. He put on two different seasons. There was a fall season and a spring season. In between, the building was used for church groups and school groups, but not really much use. But Mr. Hancher was able to bring in people from outside to do these plays, which drew crowds of some good use, some not. After about a year, they started to have a policeman on duty at all times. I guess the crowds were getting a little unruly. And to attend it, it cost you 25 cents if you wanted to sit on the ground floor. 50 cents if you wanted a balcony seat, which I guess was a little safer, a little better. And also about 1857, they brought in what they called the omnibus, which was a city bus service at the time. Just in the evening performance, to take people home from work, to take them home after the play so they could get in a little better crowd of people, hoping that way they wouldn't have to walk the streets to get home, so the husband and wife could come and show up to see the plays. However, the most popular play of all, and the longest acting play, it actually performed 7 days in a row for once, which was most unusual. And the first time it was performed in Wheeling was in November of 1856. It is now a play which we could not show now, but in those days, it was Uncle Tom's Cabin, complete with all the original music, dances, jigs, breakdowns, etc., etc. It says. This play has been performed in Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, and all cities of the country with great success. And it even mentions that they have a woman playing Eve who is 5 years old, so they're telling you she's 5 years old, even though she may be 5 foot tall. The play was so successful that, like I say, it canceled all other performances and performed it every night. And they had a special performance on a Saturday afternoon, which was unheard of. And this was so the school children and women who were not able to come into evening performances could come see the play. The same play then was performed for about every year, at least once every year after that, up until, in fact, the last performance was in 1862, which we'll get to in a minute. It was performed then for overflow crowds. The next big actor to come to Wheeling, which drew very large crowds, was a man named Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth. Edwin Booth was probably the most famous actor of his time, and he did mostly tragedies. He was known for his Shakespeare, but he liked to play the real tragic part. Well, he performed on this first night here. He played a ditty play called Richelieu, about Cardinal Richelieu of France. It is not a tragedy. It was just a normal play. The next day in the newspaper, which was very rare, someone reviewed the play and gave it a full column rather than just a few sentences. What they did was he tore it apart piece by piece, told him it was one of the worst things he had ever seen. It should never be done again. We came to see Edwin Booth do something good. The next day, Mr. Booth performed Othello, Shakespeare. The review following that was about 3 sentences, and all it said was, "That is the Edwin Booth we came to see." Although he did other plays throughout the week, and they did seem to be quite successful. Down in about 1857 to 58, the audiences were getting smaller. There was problems with the river. The large numbers of their attendance depended on people coming in off the boats from the river. And the river was too low. So they actually had to close down for a year because they were not getting enough people to pay for it. Plus, Mr. Hancher, who was the better of the managers, had quit, and they had someone else doing it, and it did not work. One of the very last things the building was really used for, just before it closed, they had a large meeting here called what they call the Union Guards. It was a local militia group of soldiers who were just organizing. And they had about a 3-night party in this place, where the ladies of Wheeling presented them not only with their uniforms, but with their flag. On July the 6th, 1859, they closed it. End of story. The theater was closed, and it remained closed until the middle of 1861. General Kelly rented the building, and if I can find my notes, I don't know how much he rented it for. He rented the building to be used as a holding house for people who were being arrested for crimes against the federal government. Mostly this crime to begin with were refusing to take the oath of allegiance to the country. So they were imprisoned here for a couple of days or so, or less, depending. And then they were shipped on to Camp Carlisle in California. Let me find my notes here real quick. Yes. Okay, General Kelly rented the two lower floors of the building in the summer of 1851 for the sum of $31.25 a month to be used at his pleasure. And like I say, it was used mainly. Well, as the war started commencing, more and more prisoners were starting to show up. Now, these were not really soldiers as such. They were militia who had been organized to fight for the Confederacy, which was still young and getting started. So they were brought here. Again, they were housed usually overnight. Then when there was enough of them, and when they mean enough, that would be 20 or 30, not very many, they would march them from the Athenaeum down Main Street, across the suspension bridge, across the island, across the covered bridge into Bridgeport, put them on a train to send them to Camp Carlisle. I'm sorry, Camp Chase. He said it was quite a thing. Citizens of Wheeling turned out to boo and to cheer, throw eggs, etc., as the prisoners did. But as the war commenced, it got to be more and more and more prisoners. So he had to bring in troops to guard them. The troops were whatever was available on Camp Carlisle on the island, which means you're bringing in people here to guard the prisoners who were themselves not even soldiers yet. They were still going through the process. So some problems arise, which we'll get to. But at the same time, a new owner decided to reopen the theater. He did. It lasted less than a year. No one wanted to come down and be mingled with all of the prisoners, even though you didn't work that way. They've only been having prisoners here a very short time. But on March the 24th, 1862, first prisoner escaped. He was called a very important prisoner, but they don't say why. He'd been escorted to the privy, which happened to be outside the prison, and no guard watched him. So, of course, he said he just simply walked away. In fact, he said he ran toward East Wheeling as fast as his legs would carry him. They were in pursuit, but they didn't catch him. He got away. So their first escape not only got away, but it was successful. In fact, throughout the whole history of the prison, the federal government kept claiming there were really very few escapes. They claimed not more than 3 or 4 successful. However, after reading the newspaper, they should have put the word dozen after that. Several dozen were successful. Or if they were caught later on, they never bothered to mention it in the paper. But as I said, they were having to use whoever was available on the prison, on the camp, the soldiers. So they were not very good. And they had their problems. The provost marshal, who was temporary, had to address some drunken soldiers. So, of course, the only place he could find to put them was in the Athenaeum. And at that time, the first floor was divided into 2 sections. One section for the guards, one section for prisoners. And Confederates and who were still being brought in, and Union prisoners were joined together. There were some 50 beds put aside to handle the prisoners. Of course, the Confederates were moved on and the 4 Union soldiers stayed. But the Union soldiers were usually locals who were drunk or did some minor punishment. If you were drunk, they would usually put a sign around your neck to make you walk up and down in front of the theater saying that you were drunk. However, if you were really drunk or really got carried away, they would put a barrel over you. And the barrel would hang with the two straps on you, and it would have a big sign. And you'd mark up and down in front of the streets in front of the building. Humiliation was supposed to work better than anything else. Well, the prisons, there got to be more and more and more Confederate prisoners. So the building was fixed in such a way where they now had to use part of the second floor as well as the first floor. The second floor was divided again in half. Half of it had 50 beds, half had a table which could seat 50 people. Again, they were mixed, both Confederates and Unions, until it got to be so many Union soldiers that they moved them all to the first floor. There also was a minor hospital built, kind of put off to one side. The hospital was handled by Dr. Frizzell, and it was mainly for some beginning Confederate prisoners who were wounded. And he handled them for a while with the help of some nuns from St. Joseph. And this went on for a couple of years, although the hospital was closed after a short time, and it was all moved of prisoners, the wounded prisoners, and the nuns all went up to the Catholic hospital in North Wheeling. Dr. Frizzell continued throughout the whole career to attend the sick here at the hospital, but it was not much anymore to handle colds and et cetera, et cetera. From this, in August of 1863, the headline said, quote, "A terrible slaughter, thousands of lives lost at the Athenaeum." It says a fierce engagement took place in front of the Athenaeum, between the provost guards and the myriads of vermin of various kinds which have so long infested the bunks and walls of what is now called Lincoln's Bastille. They had taken down all of the bunks, bedding, etc., put them in the street out on Jones Street and burned them, which was most unusual because shortly after that, the federal government took over the entire building. In September of 1863, the government rented the entire building for $1,000 a month now. On the third floor, which was the theater, they erected 13 small cells, which would be used to house prisoners who they decide to were either unruly or were important enough that they couldn't have them roaming around. They actually put bars on the windows to prevent prisoners from walking. Too many of them had climbed out of the windows and then got caught. Because, of course, the sidewalk was right below you. They bricked up some of the doorways, which again we'll mention later on in the thing. And in about the same time, let's see if I can go back to it. The walls around the bottom, 20-foot walls were built. The lower one underneath the building here was used exclusively for drilling of troops, which means the soldiers who were prisoners here now were still soldiers, so they still had to go through the process of drilling. The other parts were for the prisoners. And somewhere on one of those walls, we don't know exactly where, a bakehouse was built. So they did have their own bakery. Unfortunately, it was against one of the outer walls. And at least one prisoner was known to climb up on the roof of the bakery and then go over the wall. So either it was moved or something was done to prevent that. See, here it says it was a 20-foot wall was built and it was impossible to scale but they still found ways to get over it. In November of that year, the benevolent ladies of the city had a first-rate dinner for the sick of the hospital and all the prisoners. At that time, there were 64 prisoners in here. Most of them were for very minor reasons. If a prisoner was court-martialed and had a sentence of more than a couple of weeks or a couple of months, they were sent to Cumberland, which had a more substantial prison. And there are accounts of at least 3 men who were sent to Cumberland to be hanged under court-martial because really did not have the facilities or the ability to handle something of that nature. A Major Darr was made provost marshal. And upon his making provost marshal, things changed considerably. He actually brought in real military police type people who could better control the prisoners, who could handle what was going on. And of course, he needed it because there were more and more prisoners as time went on. One item, though, that did really get their attention that year was a branding. It was only done once. A soldier from Company D, 11th West Virginia, says he was a young lad in good health. He was on furlough. Although his parents were rebels, he decided to join the Confederacy, so he deserted. He was captured, brought back to Wheeling. He was court-martialed and then sentenced to be branded. So he was publicly branded with a hot iron on his left hip. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense because who's going to see the brand? But that's what they did. And it was also at this time was when the hospital was really moved out of the because they were getting too many prisoners. They also, at this time, also had a room put aside for women prisoners. There had been women prisoners on occasion, usually a Confederate, of course all were Confederates, for minor things, which they never really say what it was, except in the case of one, she was caught cutting telegraph lines. So she was imprisoned here. Again, she was sent to Camp Chase over in Ohio. But the women prisoners were, as they put it, a nuisance, and they really didn't know how to handle them. Prisoners, the city found a use for the prisoners. They would put a ball and chain on them and let them go out and repair and work on the city streets. One particular man was very popular. He was an Irishman, they said. He was married. He was a bricklayer by trade, and I understand was extremely good. The city streets sidewalks needed work, so he spent his days with one guard repairing and working on the sidewalks. Now he named his ball on his chain Phoebe, after his wife, who he claimed to have been greatly in love with. And this way, he said, he always had. Now, I guess you could look at that in different ways. Maybe Phoebe wasn't quite as loving as he thought. That's why she was with him. Another escape that took place was 3 men climbed the wall and escaped. They got as far as Philadelphia. The first one was arrested sitting in a bar having a drink. When arrested, he said, well, that was as far as he could go. Second one was found not too far away, still with his ball and chain, leaning up against a tree, sitting there, again, said he could not get the ball and chain off, and he was just too tired to go any further. Now, the third one may have gotten away because he is not mentioned. And then in getting to, nothing really happened. 64 was kind of a quiet year. They had guards, like I say, were better guards. Still had problems with them. But most of the prisoners by this time were Union soldiers. Fewer and fewer Confederates, because there were now more prisons to put the Confederate prisoners in. But a federal investigator comes by. First one they had from Washington. He came to the prison and decided to inspect it, which was his job. This is how he describes it. The ground floor of the building is divided into 2 apartments, which I've said. One for the guards, and other for men under sentence of court-martial for Army regulations. And at that time, said there were approximately 100 men confined to that apartment, of which is attached a kitchen, which he has found as clean and neat as the most tidy housewife could desire. On the second floor, several rooms, including an office and the kitchen. The main room is used as quarters for prisoners, for stragglers, and other soldiers who are just under temporary confinement, with bunks and tables provided for their accommodation. Then you enter the part for captured rebels, this is. A large room occupying the whole length of the building. I said the room is amply supplied with water, well ventilated, thoroughly whitewashed, and kept perfectly clean. The only problem was he asked if they please be able to open the windows. They had nailed the windows shut so the prisoners couldn't get out. He said the rations are not only good, they're very substantial, and we only wish that our prisoners in rebel hands were half as well supplied. And he said there are also 2 wards, small wards, which are neat and comfortable. And the prisoners were given at least 1 or 2 hours of recreation in the courtyards, where they could play ball, do running, jumping, reading, or anything according to their fancy. Also, which I had found this interesting, 1 member of my battery, which I researched, the Carlin Battery, was brought in and lodged in May of that year. He was under sentence. He had been in a local hospital back east someplace, but they never say why he was here, and he was in and out fairly quickly, so it must have been something very minor. Now, also toward the end of that year, they have built a building outside. This was to be the bakery. It was fairly large and was used after the Civil War as a storage space. Now, as I said, it was very rare to have ladies. But in January of '64, 2 ladies, Kate Brown and Sarah Cunard, escaped. They had been here 5 months. They were charged with cutting telegraph wires and giving aids and comfort to the enemy. They broke the lock on their door, which got them out into the hall, where they talked to a sergeant, Mr. Wells, of Company H, 19th Pennsylvania Cavalry, who happened to be guarding the prison at the time, who was in the hospital. He gave them overcoats and caps. Thus attired, it says, the 2 women passed through the guard, reached the outside of the prison, and took off. Said authorities were at loss of what to do with these abandoned wretches. It seems that not long after they left, the sergeant himself decided to desert and did so. He was not ever found again. However, the 2 ladies showed back up the next day and gave themselves up. So I guess freedom wasn't all it was supposed to have been. The hospital was inspected again. This time they have about 100 Confederates in the process of being moved. And plus 3 women, 2 of which I've already mentioned. And it said these 3 women are more trouble than all the other 100 put together. Dr. Fizel's hospital was empty, and they were very excited about the cleanliness. The baking establishment could turn out 4,000 to 5,000 loaves of bread per day. So they were kept quite busy. Let's see. Oh yes, this is really this came up on September 17th, 1864. It says there was a report given to Major Darr, who investigated it, that rats were being served for dinner. During his investigation, he found that the boys had actually caught rats and cooked some of them. And the one of them who did the cooking said they had been properly stewed and were not too bad to eat. Said in fact they tasted like a young squirrel. But he forbid it be done any longer, which the men agreed. However, the cook who had caught them and cooked them, if he wanted a rat, he could have them himself, but could not share them with anyone else. Let me see here. Okay. The prison was winding down as the war was winding down. And in September of 1865, the federal government decided to give up the prison, to close it. The main reason is the war was over. Second reason is Camp Carlisle had no soldiers. So therefore there were no guards to be used in the prison any longer. So they closed it. The original owners of the building filed a lawsuit against the federal government for damages to the building. They said that the building was no longer could be used for its purposes. And it went to court. The federal government agreed finally to make some minor changes. They agreed to remove the cells. They said half of it. They agreed to remove the walls outside. And they told the people who owned the building, whoever bought the building or decided to use it, they could take the bricks down. The doorways were okay. The wood frames were still there. All you got to do is just remove the bricks. So they put the building up for sale. Asking price $50,000. The first buyer, first prospect offered $11,000. They said no. They turned it. They tried a week later. They got a bid of $17,000. They turned it down. They finally got a bid, which they do not say what it was. But anyway, they bought it. A company called Butterfield bought the building and decided to turn it back into what is to a different business. He spent a considerable amount of money remodeling it. And the first thing he did was build a basement under the building. It had a small storeroom under there, but was never finished. He made a complete basement. And in this building, in this basement, he was going to store his stuff. He sold malt and other grains to the brewery industry. And the first floor was for other items. And the company was very, very successful for at least 2 years. And as the building now is getting described, the theater is still there, but there's nothing being used for it anymore. The ground 2 floors were used by Mr. Butterfield. And everything was going real well until 1865. 1865, and I lost my date here of it. Excuse me just a moment. Oh, here it is. 1865, November the 11th, 1865. At 12:30, fire was noticed coming out of a portion of the ground floor. Fire departments were called. In those days, though, we had only volunteer fire departments. They were a little slow in arriving. The first ones that arrived were hand pumpers, which means you had to go up and down to pump. There were not enough firemen to pump to get liquid more than past the first floor. They said, meanwhile, a very large crowd had gathered because the building was really starting to smoke. Volunteers were asked from the audience to please come and help pump, but no one volunteered, or at least not enough. Finally, the one steamer Wheeling had in his fire department arrived. It could get hosed to throw water up to the third floor. However, by that time, the building was fully engulfed. They decided to let it burn itself out and use their water to spray around succeed buildings around the building to do their best to protect them, which they did. So the building burned for approximately, they said it smoldered for approximately 3 days. But the building's not quite done. About 3 days after it, 3 young boys decided to go check the ruins to see what was going on. While they were in the ruins, they found one paper says they found a windmill, a wind socket rod hanging from the ceiling, from the rubble. The other paper just says it was a metal rod or something. Anyway, they pulled on the rod. When they did, another large beam fell, hitting the 2 boys. The papers go on to say their names were not known. One of them was slightly injured. One had to be carried home. No other explanation given. The building was insured for about $150,000, which covered most of it. But the last thing about the building is, shortly after the fire, large crowds of men were seen around the building, going through the ruins, removing whatever was possible. Metal was being put in one pile. They were getting quite a bit of the malt and stuff, had not burned, they were getting it out of the cellar. But the bricks were being going through, and very carefully, those that were salvageable were being cleaned. Those bricks then were being sold to local contractors and were used in the building of other buildings in downtown Wheeling in 1868 to 1870. So it would be interesting to see if any of those buildings were still being held up by bricks from the Athenaeum building. And I thank you. Yes, ma'am.
They figured out the cause of the fire or not?
No, they never did. They didn't investigate it. They just said it was coming from the ground floor. As far as it went. Yes, ma'am.
People were actually arrested for not pledging allegiance.
Yes, ma'am. If you would not pledge allegiance to the flag, you had to swear an oath to the U.S. government. This was mainly people like lawyers, doctors, and stuff who were Confederate leaning, but still lived in Wheeling. But if they did not swear allegiance to the government, they could be arrested, and often were. Clear up until 1863. By that time, they just be declared Confederates. arrested. Yes, ma'am.
Was there a reason that theaters were put on the top floors of buildings?
Not that I know
There
of.
are three I know of in the
Probably because it was easier to make more room for them. I have no idea. It doesn't say why. Oh, this building must have had an awfully high ceiling, because not only did it have a balcony, but there are notice of acrobat performances taking place. So somehow it had to have an awful high ceiling if you could string a wire from probably the balcony to the stage or something. And I didn't mention it, but out of curiosity, I would love to know. There was a woman, and I don't have her name right off my head, a singer who was extremely popular. She came several times to reading, always drew very large crowds. And they all came to hear her sing her last song in the performance. And they say she chanted it. I don't know what they mean by chanted it, but she chanted the La Marseillaise. But she must have some way of performing it. Really, of course, in France at that time, another revolution was taking place. La Marseillaise was very popular, even during the American Civil War. It was very popular in this country. She must have had some way to really, because they said she always had standing, cheering ovations when she gave her talk, her songs. Yes,
I can remember when the city building was on that site. And it kind of took up the whole, where the plaza is now. But it looks like the Athenaeum is smaller,
Matthew,
footprint.
it's only 80-some feet. It's only 87 feet deep.
Okay, and so where's like, do you have any idea of like where is 16th Street and where is Market Street on that layout? Market, oh, okay, I can't read that from here. Okay.
Here's Market Street.
Okay, there's Market Street.
Here's 16.
Okay.
So it's long on 16, short of. It's a shame that someone didn't bother to take a photograph of it, because they took a lot of photographs of Independence all across the street.
Sean has a question from online. He said, did you ever find out who the architect was? of the building?
No. We know who the builder was, but not the architect.